There was a time when life unfolded at a different pace, not because people made an effort to slow it down, but because there was simply no reason to hurry. Many of us remember those years not through grand events, but through small, repeated moments that quietly shaped our sense of the world. In the 1960s, time seemed to move with a gentler rhythm, one that allowed days to breathe and moments to settle before giving way to the next. We did not speak of speed or productivity. We spoke of days, of mornings and evenings, of seasons passing in ways that felt natural and unforced. In those days, waking up was not an abrupt transition, but a gradual return to the world. Mornings carried familiar sounds that did not demand attention, but offered reassurance. The clink of cups, the murmur of voices, the distant hum of daily activity beginning elsewhere. We learned, without being told, that the day would unfold as it should. There was no immediate urgency pressing against the edges of our thoughts. The morning was allowed to exist on its own terms, and we were allowed to enter it slowly. Homes were places of repetition and routine, not monotony. The arrangement of rooms, the placement of objects, and the predictable flow of daily tasks created a sense of stability that many of us carried quietly within ourselves. Meals were prepared with care, but without spectacle. Food was not rushed, nor was it consumed in isolation. The table was a place where time paused just enough for conversation to find its way naturally between bites. We learned how to listen simply by being present, how to wait our turn, how silence could be as meaningful as speech. There was an understanding, shared without explanation, that not everything needed immediate response. Letters took time to arrive, and replies took time to be written. This delay did not cause anxiety. It created space for thought. Words were chosen carefully because they would endure the journey. When a letter arrived, it was read more than once, folded again, and often kept. Communication carried weight because it required patience from both sides. Outdoors, the world felt close and accessible. Streets were not merely paths of movement, but extensions of community. People recognized one another by sight, sometimes by name, often by familiarity alone. A nod or a brief greeting was enough to affirm connection. Children learned the boundaries of their surroundings gradually, guided more by trust than by constant supervision. Play was unstructured, shaped by imagination rather than schedules. Time outside seemed endless, not because it was abundant, but because it was uninterrupted. In those years, learning happened quietly, through observation and repetition rather than instruction. We watched how adults moved through their days, how they handled difficulties, how they treated one another. Values were not announced or explained in detail. They were demonstrated. Courtesy was practiced without commentary. Responsibility was assumed, not assigned. One learned what mattered by noticing what was consistently done. Work, for many, followed clear patterns. The separation between work and home was more distinct, and with that separation came a sense of completion at the end of the day. Evenings belonged to families, to rest, to small personal rituals. There was satisfaction in finishing tasks, not because they were measured or tracked, but because they were done well enough to allow the day to close gently. Entertainment did not seek to fill every moment. There were hours when nothing particular happened, and this absence was not considered a problem. Boredom, when it appeared, was temporary and often led to creativity or reflection. Music, when played, was listened to attentively. Programs were watched collectively, not endlessly. When the broadcast ended, it ended. Silence returned, and it was accepted without discomfort. There was a collective sense that life was something to be lived alongside others, not constantly documented or evaluated. Memories were formed through repetition and shared presence rather than through deliberate preservation. We did not feel compelled to capture every moment, because moments felt secure in their own existence. They belonged to us whether or not they were recorded. Over the years, many of us came to realize that this calm was not the absence of difficulty. There were challenges, uncertainties, and losses, as there always are. Yet these experiences were woven into daily life without overwhelming it. Hardship did not erase routine. It existed alongside it. The steady structure of everyday habits offered quiet support, allowing people to endure without constant disruption. Looking back, it becomes clear that the calm we remember was not a single feeling, but a collection of practices. It lived in the way days were organized, in the patience built into communication, in the acceptance of waiting, and in the respect for time as something that unfolded rather than something to be managed. We did not name it then. We simply lived within it. As the years moved forward, changes arrived gradually, often unnoticed at first. New conveniences promised ease. New efficiencies promised improvement. At the time, these changes felt like natural progress, and in many ways they were. Yet something subtle began to shift. The space between moments grew smaller. Waiting became less acceptable. Silence felt less comfortable. We adapted, as people always do, without realizing what was being replaced. Still, the memory of that earlier rhythm remained. It stayed with us not as nostalgia alone, but as a reference point, a quiet reminder that another way of living had once felt complete. When we recall the 1960s now, we do not remember every detail clearly. What we remember is the atmosphere, the sense that time belonged to us as much as we belonged to it. That calm did not demand attention. It did not announce itself. It existed in the background, supporting daily life without calling itself important. Perhaps that is why it is only fully recognized in hindsight. In remembering it, we are not longing to return, but acknowledging something that shaped us deeply, something that continues to influence how we understand patience, connection, and the gentle passage of time. As days passed in that earlier time, the sense of order within everyday life created a quiet confidence that rarely needed to be named. Many of us moved through familiar routines without questioning their purpose, trusting that repetition itself carried meaning. The structure of the day was not rigid, but it was reliable. Morning followed night, work followed rest, and rest followed effort. This predictability was not confining. It was comforting. It allowed people to direct their attention outward, toward others and toward the simple tasks at hand, rather than inward toward constant decision-making. In many households, the day was marked by shared moments that required no planning. Meals were anticipated not as events, but as anchors, points around which the day naturally arranged itself. Breakfast signaled beginning, lunch marked a pause, and dinner brought closure. These moments were rarely hurried. Even when time was limited, there was an unspoken understanding that eating together mattered. Conversation did not need to be entertaining or profound. It simply needed to exist. In this way, relationships were maintained through presence rather than performance. Household tasks followed a steady rhythm as well. Cleaning, repairing, and maintaining were seen as ordinary responsibilities, not burdens to be avoided. There was pride in keeping things in working order, not because they were new, but because they had endured. Objects carried stories through use. Furniture showed signs of wear. Tools bore marks of repeated handling, and clothing was repaired rather than replaced without thought. These practices quietly reinforced the idea that care extended the life of both objects and relationships. Social interactions were shaped by proximity and familiarity. Many of us remember visiting without prior notice, trusting that a door would open or that another time would be suggested without offense. Hospitality did not require preparation beyond what was already available. A chair, a cup, a few minutes of conversation were enough. Time spent together did not need justification. It was understood as part of daily life, woven naturally into the flow of the week. Public spaces reflected the same unhurried character. Shops, streets, and gathering places were designed for lingering as much as for movement. People waited patiently, not because they had nothing else to do, but because waiting was part of participation. There was less expectation of immediate service, and more acceptance of human pace. Mistakes were corrected calmly, delays were acknowledged without frustration, and conversations often extended beyond their practical purpose. Children absorb these patterns instinctively. Without formal instruction, they learn when to speak and when to listen, when to move and when to remain still. They observed how adults navigated disagreement, how apologies were offered, and how forgiveness was granted without ceremony. These lessons were subtle, yet lasting. They formed a foundation that many carried into adulthood, shaping expectations about respect, patience, and shared responsibility. Education itself reflected a similar approach. Learning was not always hurried toward outcomes. Progress unfolded gradually, allowing time for understanding to deepen. Mistakes were seen as part of the process rather than failures requiring immediate correction. There was room for curiosity, for asking questions that did not need immediate answers. Knowledge accumulated steadily, supported by repetition and practice rather than constant novelty. Even leisure followed this measured tempo. Free time was not something to be filled deliberately, but something that appeared naturally once obligations were met. People rested without guilt, confident that rest was deserved. Reading, walking, listening, or simply sitting were accepted forms of occupation. Silence was not treated as emptiness. It was a space in which thoughts could settle and emotions could find balance. Communication, too, reflected patience. Conversations unfolded without interruption, allowing speakers to complete their thoughts. Listening was an active presence rather than a pause before speaking. Disagreements, when they arose, were often addressed with restraint. Words were chosen carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for their lasting impact. This approach did not eliminate conflict, but it softened its edges, preventing it from overwhelming relationships. Seasonal changes played a larger role in shaping daily awareness. Without constant artificial stimulation, people noticed shifts in light, temperature, and atmosphere. These changes influenced routines naturally. Activities adapted to weather and daylight without resistance. There was an acceptance that certain times were suited to activity and others to rest. This alignment with natural cycles reinforced a sense of continuity between personal life and the wider world. Over time, these accumulated habits created a shared understanding of what it meant to live well. Success was not measured by speed or visibility, but by stability and contribution. Being reliable, considerate, and attentive carried quiet esteem. Recognition came not through display, but through consistency. People were known for how they showed up day after day, rather than for singular achievements. As years passed, many of us carried these internalized rhythms forward, even as circumstances began to change. We adapted to new demands while retaining traces of earlier patterns. The memory of that calm did not vanish. It settled beneath the surface, influencing how we responded to pressure and change. In moments of uncertainty, those ingrained habits offered guidance, reminding us that steadiness could coexist with progress. Looking back now, it becomes apparent that the calm of that era was not accidental. It was a result of countless small choices made collectively, often without conscious awareness. People accepted limitations, respected time, and valued presence. These choices shaped an environment in which life felt manageable, not because it was simple, but because it was paced. This understanding grows clearer with distance. The calm we remember was not static. It evolved gently, accommodating growth while preserving balance. It allowed individuals to feel part of something larger without losing their sense of self. In recalling it, we are not measuring against the present, but recognizing its influence, acknowledging how deeply it shaped our expectations of what life could feel like when allowed to unfold without constant urgency. That influence remains quietly active, resurfacing in moments when we slow our steps, when we wait without irritation, when we choose to listen fully. These moments echo a time when calm was not a goal to be achieved, but a natural condition of living. Through memory, that condition continues to offer perspective, reminding us that another rhythm once existed, steady and sufficient, guiding ordinary days with quiet assurance. As we reflect further on those years, it becomes evident that much of what defined daily life was shaped by an unspoken agreement about limits. There was a shared acceptance that not everything could be done at once, and that not every desire required immediate fulfillment. This acceptance was not experienced as loss, but as balance. Many of us learned early that patience was not something imposed, but something practiced naturally, reinforced by the pace of the world around us. Time itself felt less fragmented. The day was not divided into countless competing demands, but flowed through broader segments that allowed attention to remain focused. When one task was undertaken, it was given a space to be completed without constant interruption. This created a sense of continuity, a feeling that actions belonged to a larger whole rather than standing alone. Even simple chores carried a quiet satisfaction, as they contributed to the steady maintenance of daily life. In conversation, this continuity was equally present. Exchanges were rarely rushed toward conclusions. People spoke knowing they would be heard, and listened knowing they would have their turn. Silence was allowed to settle between words, giving thoughts time to form. These pauses were not awkward, they were respectful. They acknowledged that understanding often required a moment of reflection before response. The pace of information reinforced this approach. News arrived at intervals that allowed it to be absorbed gradually. Events were discussed, considered, and placed within a broader context before being replaced by new developments. This slower flow did not diminish awareness. It deepened it. People formed opinions over time, shaped by repeated exposure and discussion rather than immediate reaction. Memory played a larger role, as information lingered long enough to become part of shared understanding. Within families, generational continuity was more visibly present. Older and younger members shared space and time regularly, allowing values and stories to pass naturally between them. Advice was offered sparingly, often through example rather than instruction. Younger generations learned by observing how elders approached work, conflict, and rest. In return, elders remained connected to the evolving world through daily interaction rather than distance. There was also a greater tolerance for imperfection. Objects, routines, and even people were not expected to perform flawlessly. Small flaws were accepted as signs of use and effort rather than reasons for replacement. This acceptance extended to daily life as well. A delayed task, an unfinished conversation, or an unresolved question did not automatically create anxiety. It was understood that some things would be addressed in time. This tolerance fostered resilience. When difficulties arose, they were met within an existing framework of stability. Life did not stop in response to challenges. It adjusted. Routine provided a sense of grounding, allowing people to navigate uncertainty without losing their bearings. Hardship was not romanticized, but neither was it allowed to dominate the entire experience of living. The physical environment supported the steadiness. Homes and neighborhoods were designed to be lived in over time, not constantly updated or rearranged. Familiarity bred comfort. Knowing where things belong, both physically and socially, reduced the need for constant adaptation. This familiarity did not prevent change, but ensured that change occurred gradually, allowing individuals to adjust without disruption. Workplaces reflected similar values. Expectations were often clear, roles were understood, and progress was measured through consistency rather than constant acceleration. Pride came from reliability and craftsmanship, from doing one's part well and contributing to a shared outcome. Recognition was subtle, embedded in trust rather than frequent evaluation. This environment encouraged a steady commitment rather than a relentless push for advancement. Leisure remained intertwined with daily life rather than standing apart as a separate pursuit. Enjoyment was found in ordinary moments, not reserved for special occasions. A walk, a shared meal, or a quiet evening held value precisely because they were accessible and repeatable. Pleasure was not something to be maximized, but something to be noticed when it appeared. As communication technologies evolved slowly, their presence did not yet dominate attention. Tools were used purposefully rather than constantly. When a device served its function, it was set aside. Attention returned to the immediate environment. This allowed people to remain grounded in their surroundings, attentive to those physically present rather than divided across multiple points of focus. Over time, these patterns cultivated a deep sense of belonging. Individuals felt connected not only to people, but to places and routines that gave shape to their lives. Identity was formed through participation rather than presentation. One knew who they were through what they did repeatedly, through the roles they fulfilled and the relationships they maintained over time. As we recall this now, it becomes clear that calm was reinforced by mutual consideration. People adjusted their pace to accommodate one another. Waiting was seen as cooperative rather than wasteful. Time was shared rather than competed over. This collective adjustment reduced friction, allowing interactions to proceed smoothly even when circumstances were imperfect. The absence of constant urgency allowed room for reflection. People thought about their choices, their responsibilities, and their relationships without feeling pressure to decide immediately. This reflection fostered discernment, a careful weighing of options that valued long-term consequences over short-term gains. Decisions were not always correct, but they were made with intention rather than haste. As years passed and the world gradually changed, these deeply ingrained habits did not disappear overnight. They persisted quietly, influencing how many of us responded to new expectations. Even as life accelerated, there remained an internal reference point, a memory of steadier days that informed our sense of balance. That memory does not belong to a single moment or event. It is composed of countless ordinary experiences, layered over time. It emerges when we recall how days once felt complete without being full, how relationships grew through presence rather than constant exchange, how time itself seemed generous rather than scarce. In continuing to reflect on that era, we recognize that its calm was not a fragile condition easily broken, but a durable quality sustained through collective habits. It did not require conscious protection because it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Understanding this helps us appreciate its lasting influence, not as something lost, but as something that continues to shape our perception of what it means to live with patience, continuity, and quiet assurance. As we move deeper into those remembered years, another quality becomes increasingly apparent: the way attention was given fully to whatever was happening in the present moment. Many of us did not think of this as a practice or a discipline. It was simply the natural result of a world that asked less of our immediate reaction and more of our steady presence. When something was happening, it held our focus because there were fewer competing demands pulling us elsewhere. Daily activities unfolded with a sense of completeness. A task began, progressed, and ended without being constantly interrupted by something else. This allowed people to feel that their efforts were contained, that each action had a clear place within the day. Even repetitive work carried meaning because it was performed with awareness rather than distraction. The hands were busy, and so was the mind, but both were aligned toward the same purpose. This alignment extended into social life as well. When people gathered, they were truly together. Conversations were not divided by external interruptions or distant concerns. The simple act of sitting with others created a shared space that felt whole. Attention was given generously, not parceled out in fragments. This generosity of attention fostered trust, allowing relationships to deepen gradually and naturally. Listening, in particular, was shaped by this environment. To listen was not merely to wait for one's turn to speak, but to receive what was being said without immediate judgment or response. People absorbed stories, opinions, and concerns fully before replying. This created a rhythm of exchange that felt balanced, with each voice finding room to be heard. Disagreements, when they occurred, unfolded within this rhythm, making them easier to navigate without escalation. The sense of presence also influenced how people related to their surroundings. There was greater awareness of physical space, of light and shadow, of sound and stillness. A room was not just a place to pass through, but a setting that shaped experience. The creak of a floor, the movement of air through an open window, the gradual change of daylight throughout the day were noticed without being named. These sensory details grounded people in the moment, reinforcing connection to their immediate environment. Movement itself reflected this groundedness. Walking was often unhurried, guided by necessity rather than speed. Journeys were not always optimized for efficiency. They were accepted as part of the experience of going from one place to another. This allowed time for observation, for brief encounters, for moments of thought that emerged naturally while moving through familiar spaces. In public life, this pace encouraged civility. People adjusted to one another's presence with small gestures of consideration. Doors were held, space was shared, and waiting was approached with patience. These behaviors were not the result of formal rules, but of shared expectations about how one should move among others. Courtesy was not emphasized as a moral principle. It was simply practiced. Within this atmosphere, emotions were expressed with restraint, but not suppression. Joy, concern, disappointment, and satisfaction all found expression, yet rarely overwhelmed the broader flow of life. Feelings were acknowledged without becoming the sole focus of attention. This balance allowed individuals to experience emotion fully while remaining connected to their responsibilities and relationships. The passage of time was marked less by deadlines and more by continuity. Days led into weeks, weeks into seasons, without constant emphasis on milestones. Celebrations existed, but they did not dominate the calendar. Ordinary days carried weight precisely because they were not overshadowed by constant anticipation of the next event. This gave life a sense of fullness rooted in the present rather than projected into the future. Memory itself was shaped by this steady accumulation of experience. Without constant recording or documentation, memories formed through repetition, and shared moments. Certain routines, conversations, and places became familiar enough to settle deeply into recollection. These memories were not isolated highlights, but part of a continuous narrative that gave coherence to the past. Work and rest were held in careful balance. Effort was expected, but exhaustion was not glorified. There was an understanding that productivity had limits, and that rest was necessary to sustain both body and mind. Evenings and weekends offered genuine pauses, allowing people to recover without feeling that they were falling behind. This rhythm supported endurance over time rather than short bursts of intensity. The absence of constant comparison also contributed to the calm of the era. People were less exposed to the lives of others beyond their immediate circles. Success and failure were understood within local contexts rather than against distant standards. This reduced pressure to perform or present oneself in a particular way. Individuals were known for who they were within their communities, not for how they appeared to a wider audience. As a result, self-worth was often grounded in contribution rather than visibility. Doing one's part, however modest, carried its own validation. Recognition came quietly, through trust and respect earned over time. This fostered a sense of dignity that did not depend on external affirmation. People felt secure in their roles because those roles were stable and understood. As we reflect on this now, it becomes clear that the calm of those years was supported by a shared understanding of pace, attention, and presence. These elements reinforce one another, creating an environment in which life could be lived with steadiness rather than urgency. Change occurred, but it unfolded within a framework that allowed adjustment without disorientation. That framework did not require constant reinforcement. It was maintained through daily habits, through the way people spoke, moved, worked, and rested. Its strength lay in its quiet persistence, in its ability to shape experience without drawing attention to itself. Remembering this aspect of the past does not require idealization. It simply invites recognition of how deeply environment and habit influence our perception of time. The calm we recall was not an abstract quality, but a lived reality sustained by countless ordinary choices. In acknowledging it, we gain insight into how such calm once emerged naturally, and how its traces continue to inform our sense of balance, even as the world around us moves ever more quickly. As the years of that decade unfolded, another quiet dimension of daily life revealed itself through the way people related to time beyond the immediate day. There was a broader sense of continuity that extended backward and forward, linking past experience with future expectation without urgency. Many of us lived with an implicit awareness that life was not a sequence of isolated moments, but a long thread, strengthened by patience and consistency. Plans existed, but they were held lightly, allowing room for adjustment and acceptance. Anticipation, when it arose, was measured. Looking forward to something did not diminish attention to what was already present. The future was approached with hope rather than haste. There was trust that what needed to arrive would do so in its own time. This trust reduced anxiety and allowed people to invest fully in the present without feeling that they were missing something elsewhere. This outlook shaped how progress was understood. Improvement was expected to be gradual, unfolding through effort sustained over time. There was less emphasis on rapid transformation and more appreciation for steady growth. Skills were developed through practice rather than shortcuts. Mastery was respected precisely because it required patience. Watching someone become proficient over years reinforced a belief that time invested thoughtfully yielded lasting results. Relationships benefited from this same patience. Connections deepened slowly, strengthened by shared experiences rather than accelerated intimacy. Trust was built through reliability, through showing up consistently rather than making grand gestures. Disagreements, when they occurred, were often resolved over time rather than through immediate confrontation. Space was allowed for reflection, cooling of emotions, and eventual understanding. The way people handled change reflected this measured approach. Adjustments were made carefully, with attention to their broader impact. New ideas were considered thoughtfully before being adopted. There was curiosity, but also discernment. Not every novelty demanded immediate embrace. This selectiveness preserved continuity, while still allowing for evolution. Daily schedules were flexible enough to accommodate the unexpected. An unplanned visit, a delayed task, or a change in routine did not automatically disrupt the entire day. There was room to adapt without feeling overwhelmed. This flexibility came from not overfilling time, from leaving margins that allowed life to breathe. Within communities, this breathing space supported mutual support. People were available to one another in practical ways, not because they had excess time, but because time was organized to allow responsiveness. Helping a neighbor, attending to a shared concern, or simply offering presence did not feel like interruptions. They were part of the rhythm of living together. The absence of constant urgency also shaped how people experienced aging and stages of life. Growing older was seen as a gradual transition rather than a sudden shift. Each stage carried its own expectations and privileges, understood collectively. There was respect for experience accumulated over time and patience for those still learning. This mutual recognition fostered a sense of belonging across generations. Memory played a central role in maintaining this continuity. Stories were told and retold, not as performances, but as shared recollections that reinforced identity. These stories connected individuals to their families, communities, and broader history. Remembering was a collective act, strengthening bonds and providing context for present circumstances. The physical pace of life supported this reflective relationship with time. Without constant acceleration, people noticed repetition and variation within routines. Subtle changes became meaningful. A familiar place altered slightly, a habit adjusted over years, a relationship evolving quietly. These observations reinforced awareness of time as a companion rather than an adversary. Work carried the sense of duration as well. Careers were often understood as long commitments rather than rapid progressions. Loyalty and persistence were valued. The idea of staying, of investing oneself in a place or role over many years, was respected. This continuity provided stability not only for individuals, but for the structures they supported. Rest, too, was approached with an understanding of long-term balance. Taking breaks was not framed as indulgence, but as maintenance. The body and mind were acknowledged as requiring care over time. This recognition prevented exhaustion from becoming a constant condition. Recovery was integrated into life rather than postponed indefinitely. Leisure activities reflected endurance rather than intensity. Enjoyment was often found in activities that could be repeated without diminishing satisfaction. Hobbies, walks, conversations, and shared meals offered ongoing pleasure precisely because they were sustainable. There was no pressure to extract maximum excitement from every moment. As communication remained measured, misunderstandings were less likely to escalate quickly. Clarification took place through continued interaction rather than instant reaction. This reduced conflict and allowed relationships to absorb strain without breaking. Patience acted as a buffer, protecting connections from unnecessary damage. The broader cultural atmosphere reinforced these individual experiences. Expectations aligned around a shared understanding of time and effort. While differences existed, there was a general agreement that life required persistence and that rewards often arrived slowly. This collective mindset reduced competition and comparison, allowing people to focus on their own paths. Looking back now, it becomes clear that this orientation toward time fostered resilience. When change eventually accelerated, many of us drew upon these earlier habits to maintain balance. The memory of steadier days provided a reference point, reminding us that it was possible to live without constant urgency. This reference point did not demand a return to the past. It simply offered perspective. It suggested that calm was not incompatible with progress, and that patience could coexist with ambition. The way time was once held shaped our understanding of endurance, teaching us that a life well lived was not rushed, but sustained. As we continue to reflect, the calm of that era appears not as a fragile memory, but as a durable influence. It persists in the ways we still value consistency, depth, and continuity. It reminds us that time, when respected rather than hurried, can support a life of quiet strength, unfolding steadily across years without losing its sense of purpose. As we continue to dwell within the texture of those years, another subtle element of daily life becomes visible in the way effort was distributed across time. There was a quiet understanding that energy, like time, was not unlimited, and that it needed to be spent carefully. People rarely spoke of balance as a concept, yet their days reflected it naturally. Activity and rest alternated in ways that felt instinctive, allowing life to proceed without constant strain. Fatigue existed, as it always has, but it was not normalized as a permanent condition. Tiredness signaled the need for pause rather than something to be overcome indefinitely. When the body asked for rest, it was often granted. This responsiveness prevented exhaustion from becoming habitual. Recovery was woven into daily life, allowing people to return to their tasks with steadier attention and renewed patience. This rhythm shaped how obligations were approached. Responsibilities were taken seriously, but they were not multiplied unnecessarily. There was a clearer sense of what truly required attention and what could wait. This discernment reduced the feeling of being constantly behind. Completing a task brought closure rather than immediate replacement by another demand. The end of an effort was allowed to feel like an ending. In domestic life, this translated into routines that were sustainable rather than optimized. Homes functioned efficiently, but not at the expense of comfort. Tasks were spaced throughout the day and week, creating a manageable flow. No single moment carried excessive burden. The household moved as a whole, with each part contributing quietly to overall stability. This shared movement extended to family life. Expectations were communicated implicitly through example rather than pressure. Children learned responsibility gradually, absorbing it through participation rather than instruction. Small duties were introduced at a pace that matched growing capability. In this way, effort became associated with belonging rather than obligation. The absence of constant urgency allowed people to develop a deeper awareness of their own limits. Knowing when to stop, when to slow down, and when to continue was learned through experience rather than instruction. This self-awareness fostered resilience, as individuals could adjust their pace in response to changing circumstances without losing direction. Social commitments reflected this same restraint. Engagements were fewer, but more meaningful. Time spent together was valued precisely because it was not overextended. Saying yes carried weight, and saying no did not require elaborate justification. This selectiveness protected relationships from becoming strained by excess. The broader pace of life supported thoughtful decision-making. Choices were rarely made under immediate pressure. Even significant decisions were approached with patience, allowing time for consideration and consultation. Advice was sought from those with experience, and this counsel was received with respect. Decisions emerged from dialogue rather than impulse. In public discourse, this patience contributed to a more measured exchange of ideas. Opinions were formed gradually, shaped by repeated exposure rather than instant reaction. People were accustomed to living with uncertainty, allowing questions to remain unresolved until clarity emerged. This tolerance for ambiguity reduced anxiety and prevented hasty conclusions. The physical environment reinforced this steadiness. Without constant sensory stimulation, attention rested easily. Sounds, sights, and movements were absorbed without overload. The world did not demand continuous response. This allowed the nervous system to remain calmer, supporting sustained focus and emotional balance. Leisure time offered genuine restoration. Activities were chosen for their ability to replenish rather than excite excessively. Reading, listening, walking, and quiet conversation allowed the mind to settle. These practices were not framed as self-care, but as ordinary parts of life. Their restorative effect was understood implicitly through experience. Even celebrations reflected moderation. Joy was expressed openly, but not exaggerated. Festivities were meaningful because they stood apart from everyday life rather than attempting to replace it. Afterward, routine returned smoothly, without the sense of loss that can accompany constant stimulation. The way people related to achievement further supported this calm. Accomplishments were acknowledged, but they did not redefine identity entirely. Success was integrated into life rather than elevated above it. Failure, when it occurred, was absorbed without catastrophic consequence. Both were understood as part of a longer journey, rather than final judgments. As time passed, this approach cultivated endurance. People learned to sustain effort across years, rather than expending it quickly. Projects unfolded slowly, relationships matured steadily, and personal growth occurred through accumulation rather than transformation. This endurance allowed individuals to face change with greater stability. When challenges arose, They were met within this framework of measured effort. Support systems functioned effectively because they were not constantly depleted. People had reserves to draw upon, both individually and collectively. This capacity for response reduced the impact of adversity, allowing recovery without collapse. Reflecting now, we see that this calm was supported by a collective respect for limits. Recognizing when enough was enough prevented escalation and preserved well-being. Time and energy were treated as resources to be stewarded rather than exploited. This stewardship sustained the rhythm of life over long periods. The memory of this restraint remains instructive. It reminds us that steadiness is not passive, but intentional, shaped by countless small decisions made consistently. The calm we recall was not the absence of effort, but the presence of wisdom in how effort was applied. As we carry this understanding forward, it offers a lens through which to view our own lives. It suggests that calm emerges not from avoiding responsibility, but from engaging with it at a human pace. The legacy of those years lives on in this insight, quietly affirming that a life shaped by moderation and awareness can remain resilient even as the world around accelerates. As we continue this reflection, the social fabric of that time becomes more clearly defined by the way people understood their place within a larger whole. There was a strong, though often unspoken, sense of mutual dependence. Individuals recognized that their actions affected others, and this awareness shaped behavior in subtle but consistent ways. Consideration was not framed as an obligation. It was simply part of how one moved through the world. Community life unfolded through repeated encounters rather than organized events. People crossed paths naturally, often in the same places and at similar times, allowing familiarity to grow without effort. These repeated interactions created a quiet trust, a sense that one belonged without needing formal inclusion. Recognition did not require conversation. Being seen regularly was enough to affirm connection. This familiarity encouraged responsibility towards shared spaces. Streets, shops, and gathering places were treated with care because they were understood as extensions of the community itself. Cleanliness, order, and maintenance were not enforced constantly. They were upheld collectively. People adjusted their behavior because they felt accountable to one another, not because rules demanded compliance. The pace of these interactions reinforced patience. Waiting for one another was an accepted part of daily life. Whether standing in line, pausing in conversation, or allowing someone else to move first, these small acts accumulated into a broader culture of consideration. Time was shared rather than claimed. No one expected to move ahead at the expense of others. This shared rhythm influenced how differences were managed. Diversity of opinion, temperament, and background existed, yet it was accommodated within the framework of mutual respect. Disagreement did not immediately threaten cohesion. There was room for variation without fragmentation. People learned to live alongside differences without constant need for resolution. Language itself reflected this restraint. Speech tended to be measured, avoiding unnecessary excess. Words were chosen with care, partly because communication carried weight, and partly because silence was not feared. Speaking less did not imply lacking something to say. It often suggested attentiveness and thoughtfulness. In family life, these social patterns were reinforced daily. Roles were understood through observation rather than explanation. Elders guided quietly, modeling behavior rather than issuing directives. Younger members absorbed expectations gradually, learning when to assert themselves and when to yield. Authority was present, but it was exercise of restraint, allowing autonomy to develop naturally. Friendships grew through shared time rather than shared activities alone. Simply being together was sufficient. Conversations did not need to be purposeful or entertaining. Presence itself sustained connection. This allowed relationships to endure periods of silence or distance without dissolving. Trust was resilient because it was built slowly. The concept of privacy was also shaped by this balance. People respected boundaries without isolating themselves. There was an understanding of when to engage and when to step back. This sensitivity prevented intrusion while maintaining closeness. It allowed individuals to feel both supported and independent. Public life mirrored these dynamics. Institutions functioned with an emphasis on continuity rather than constant change. Expectations were stable enough to provide predictability, yet flexible enough to accommodate human variation. Procedures unfolded at a pace that allowed understanding, reducing frustration and confusion. This steadiness extended to how people responded to errors. Mistakes were acknowledged without excessive drama. Correction was offered calmly, often with an assumption of good intent. This approach preserved dignity and encouraged learning rather than defensiveness. People were more willing to take responsibility when they were not overwhelmed by judgment. The absence of constant evaluation allowed individuals to develop confidence quietly. Self-assurance emerged through experience rather than affirmation. People learned their capabilities by using them, gradually expanding what they could handle. This organic growth reduced the need for comparison and validation. As a result, identity was grounded in continuity rather than performance. One sense of self developed through roles sustained over time, through contributions made consistently rather than achievements displayed prominently. This grounding provided stability, particularly during periods of change. The relationship between effort and reward was understood within this framework. Immediate outcomes were not always expected. People were accustomed to investing time without guaranteed results. This patience fostered perseverance, allowing projects and relationships to unfold naturally without constant pressure for proof of progress. As we look back now, we can see how the social atmosphere supported calm. It reduced friction, softened conflict, and allowed individuals to move through life with a sense of belonging. The absence of constant urgency made space for empathy, enabling people to consider one another without feeling rushed. This calm did not eliminate complexity. Life was still demanding, relationships still required effort, and uncertainty still existed. Yet these challenges were held within a structure that allowed people to respond rather than react. The pace of life provided room for thought, adjustment, and recovery. The memory of the social fabric remains influential. Even as the world has changed, many of us still recognize the value of these patterns. We notice when interactions feel hurried or fragmented, and we remember that another way once felt normal. This memory does not accuse the present. It simply offers contrast. In recalling the social rhythm of those years, we are reminded that calm often arises not from isolation, but from connection managed with care. It emerges when people move together at a pace that allows mutual recognition. The legacy of that era lives on in this understanding, quietly affirming that shared time, when respected and unhurried, can sustain both individual dignity and collective harmony. As we remain within this unfolding memory, attention naturally turns to the way meaning was drawn from ordinary repetition. In that earlier time, significance did not depend on constant variation. Many of us found reassurance in familiar, in the knowledge that certain elements of life will return each day largely unchanged. This repetition was not dull. It was grounding. It created a dependable framework within which subtle differences could be noticed and appreciated. Daily routines were rarely questioned. They were accepted as part of the structure that held life together. Rising, preparing, working, resting, and returning home formed a cycle that required little explanation. Because these patterns were stable, attention could shift toward the quality of experience within them rather than toward their arrangement. Life felt inhabitable rather than constantly under construction. This sense of inhabiting time allowed people to notice nuance. A small change in mood, a variation in weather, a difference in tone during a familiar conversation could carry meaning precisely because it occurred against a steady background. When everything was not constantly changing, change itself became more visible. This heightened awareness contributed to a deeper sense of presence. Repetition also reinforced competence. Performing the same tasks regularly allowed skill to develop naturally. Familiarity bred confidence, reducing anxiety about performance. People knew what was expected of them and trusted their ability to meet those expectations. This confidence did not need reinforcement. It was sustained through practice. The predictability of routine extended to social rhythms as well. People often encounter one another in consistent patterns, creating a sense of reliability. Knowing when and where others would be present reduced uncertainty and fostered ease. Interactions did not need to be scheduled meticulously. They emerged organically from shared habits. This organic emergence of connection reduced the sense of isolation. Even when alone, Individuals felt embedded within a broader flow of life. The day itself carried company through its familiar progression. Solitude did not equate to disconnection, because belonging was sustained through continuity rather than constant contact. Memory benefited from this steadiness. Recollections were not overwhelmed by novelty. Instead, they formed layers, with repeated experiences reinforcing one another. Certain moments stood out not because they were extraordinary, but because they were embedded within a well-known context. This layering gave memory depth and coherence. The pace of cultural change supported this process. Shifts occurred slowly enough to be integrated gradually. New ideas, technologies, and practices were absorbed into existing frameworks rather than replacing them abruptly. This allowed people to adapt without feeling disoriented. Continuity was preserved even as progress unfolded. This gradual integration shaped attitudes toward improvement. There was less pressure to reinvent oneself continually. Growth was understood as refinement rather than transformation. Individuals built upon what they already knew, extending their capabilities incrementally. This approach reduced fear of falling behind and encouraged sustained engagement. The sense of continuity also influenced how people related to history. The past was not distant or abstract. It was present in routines, in language, in customs that persisted over time. These connections created a feeling of inheritance, of participating in something larger than one's own lifespan. Life felt linked rather than isolated. Within families, this inheritance was especially visible. Habits were passed down not as formal lessons, but through shared practice. Ways of preparing food, of organizing time, of handling disagreement were absorbed through observation. These inherited patterns provided guidance without limiting individuality. The absence of constant reinvention also reduced pressure to define oneself explicitly. Identity emerged through participation rather than articulation. People were known through their roles, relationships, and consistency rather than through deliberate self-presentation. This allowed identity to remain flexible, adapting naturally as circumstances changed. Work environments reflected the same emphasis on continuity. Institutional memory mattered. Experience was valued because it carried knowledge accumulated over time. Processes evolved, but they did so with respect for what had proven effective. This respect fostered stability and trust within organizations. Leisure, too, benefited from repetition. Enjoyment deepened rather than diminished through familiarity. Returning to the same places, activities, or conversations offered comfort rather than boredom. Pleasure was found in refinement, in noticing small improvements or variations rather than seeking constant novelty. The rhythm of the week reinforced this balance. Days carried distinct characters, shaped by custom rather than scheduling alone. Certain activities belonged to certain times, creating a natural flow. This structure reduced decision fatigue and allowed people to anticipate transitions without anxiety. Even language carried traces of this steadiness. Expressions and phrases repeated across generations, carrying shared meaning. Communication relied on common understanding rather than constant clarification. This shared language reinforced connection and reduced misunderstanding. As we reflect now, it becomes clear that repetition was not experienced as limitation, but as support. It provided a stable ground for which curiosity and variation could emerge safely. The calm of that era was sustained by this balance between sameness and difference, between routine and nuance. This balance also supported emotional regulation. Familiar structures provided comfort during times of uncertainty. When external circumstances became challenging, routine offered reassurance. Knowing what to expect allowed people to conserve emotional energy for what truly required attention. The memory of this quality lingers because it speaks to a fundamental human need for rhythm. We recognize, often instinctively, when life lacks this grounding. The recollection of earlier steadiness offers insight into how repetition can sustain meaning rather than diminish it. In acknowledging this, we do not idealize the past. We simply recognize how deeply these patterns shaped our experience of time and belonging. The calm we remember was not accidental. It was built patiently through repetition, through shared habits that allowed life to feel coherent. As this reflection continues, the role of continuity becomes ever clearer. It reminds us that meaning often emerges not from constant change, but from sustained presence within familiar forms. The legacy of that era lives on in this understanding, quietly affirming that a life anchored in rhythm can remain rich, attentive, and whole, even as the world around it continues to evolve. As our reflection deepens, another aspect of that time comes gently into focus, the way uncertainty was accommodated rather than resisted. Life in those years did not offer constant reassurance, yet it did not demand constant control either. Many of us lived with unanswered questions without feeling compelled to resolve them immediately. Uncertainty was woven into daily experience as a natural condition, not an error to be corrected. This acceptance reduced tension and allowed people to move forward without needing complete clarity at every step. Decisions were often made with incomplete information, guided by experience, intuition, and shared norms rather than exhaustive analysis. This did not mean choices were careless. On the contrary, they were grounded in a practical understanding of life's unpredictability. People knew that circumstances would change, and they trusted their ability to adapt when they did. This trust fostered confidence, not in outcomes, but in one's capacity to respond. The slower pace of change supported this mindset. Because developments unfolded gradually, there was time to adjust expectations and revise plans without panic. Sudden disruption was less common, and when it occurred, it was absorbed into existing routines rather than overturning them entirely. Stability did not eliminate surprise, but it softened its impact. This relationship with uncertainty shaped emotional life as well. Anxiety existed, as it always has, but it was less amplified by constant anticipation. Without a steady stream of alerts and projections, worries remained proportionate to immediate circumstances. People focused on what was within reach rather than on distant possibilities. This focus conserved emotional energy and supported resilience. Hope, in this context, was quieter but steadier. It was not fueled by constant promise of improvement, but by faith in continuity. People believed that life would continue, that challenges would pass, and that effort would matter over time. This belief did not depend on optimism about specific outcomes. It rested on confidence in the endurance of ordinary life. The way people spoke about the future reflected this calm. Plans were mentioned without excessive detail, and expectations were held with flexibility. There was room for revision without disappointment. The future was approached as an extension of the present rather than a separate realm requiring constant preparation. This orientation influenced how success and failure were perceived. Outcomes were understood as part of a larger process rather than definitive judgments. A setback did not erase previous effort, nor did success guarantee permanence. This perspective reduced pressure and allowed people to continue without being overly attached to results. In relationships, this tolerance for uncertainty allowed space for growth and change. People accepted that others would evolve over time, sometimes in unexpected ways. Differences were negotiated gradually rather than forced into resolution. This patience preserved connection, even when understanding was incomplete. The absence of constant forecasting also supported presence. Without needing to anticipate every possible scenario, attention remained grounded in what was happening now. This groundedness fostered satisfaction with what was available rather than dissatisfaction with what might be missing. Work life reflected similar patterns. Long-term effort was valued even when immediate results were not visible. Progress was assessed through persistence rather than rapid advancement. This allowed individuals to remain engaged without constant validation, trusting that their contribution would accumulate meaningfully over time. Learning, too, was approached with patience. Understanding was allowed to deepen slowly. Not knowing was not immediately framed as a deficiency. Questions could remain open, inviting exploration rather than demanding answers. This openness encouraged curiosity without pressure. The cultural atmosphere supported this approach by limiting exposure to distant uncertainties. News was local and periodic, allowing people to focus on their immediate environment. Global concerns existed, but they did not dominate daily consciousness. This containment of information preserved mental space for personal and communal life. As a result, people often felt more capable of influencing their immediate circumstances. Attention was directed toward what could be touched, changed, or improved directly. This focus fostered agency without overwhelming responsibility. Individuals acted where they could and accepted what lay beyond their control. The natural environment reinforced this lesson. Weather, seasons, and cycles reminded people of forces larger than themselves. These forces were respected rather than resisted. Adaptation was preferred to control. This relationship with nature offered perspective, placing personal concerns within a broader context. As time passed, this acceptance of uncertainty contributed to emotional steadiness. People learned to live alongside doubt without being consumed by it. They trusted that clarity would emerge when needed, and that not everything required immediate resolution. Reflecting now, we can see how this attitude supported the calm we remember. It reduced urgency, softened fear, and allowed life to unfold without constant interference. The willingness to live with uncertainty was not passive resignation. It was an active trust in continuity, in one's own resilience, and the shared structures that supported daily life. This trust was reinforced through experience. Each time uncertainty was met and survived, confidence grew. Over years, this accumulation of experience formed a quiet assurance that life could be navigated without constant control. This assurance did not eliminate difficulty, but provided stability amid change. The memory of this mindset remains significant in a world increasingly oriented toward prediction and prevention. Recalling a time when uncertainty was tolerated offers perspective. It suggests that calm is not achieved by eliminating the unknown, but by learning to coexist with it. As we continue this reflection, the calm of that era appears ever more rooted in trust. Trust in time, in people, and in one's own capacity to adapt. This trust allowed life to feel spacious rather than constrained, unfolding steadily even when the path ahead was not fully visible. The legacy of that trust persists quietly. It surfaces when we choose patience over haste, acceptance over anxiety, and presence over anticipation. In remembering how uncertainty was once held, we are reminded that calm can emerge not from certainty, but from confidence in continuity. As the reflection continues, attention turns naturally to ways silence was woven into daily life without being named or defended. Silence was not treated as absence, nor was it summoned to be filled at the first opportunity. It existed as a companion to sound, creating balance rather than discomfort. Many of us grew accustomed to moments when nothing was said, and in those moments, understanding often deepened rather than diminished. Silence appeared in conversation as a pause that allowed meaning to settle. After a thought was expressed, there was time for it to be received fully. Responses were not rushed into existence. This space honored the weight of words and acknowledged that comprehension required more than speed. Silence was a sign of respect, signaling that what had been said mattered enough to consider carefully. In domestic life, silence carried reassurance. The quiet presence of others in the same space created a sense of companionship that did not depend on constant interaction. Reading, working, or resting together without speaking reinforced connection rather than weakening it. Being alone in the presence of others felt natural and safe. The rhythm of the day included extended periods of calm without stimulation. Evenings often unfolded without background noise, allowing thoughts to wander gently. In these moments, reflection emerged organically. People revisited the events of the day, considered small decisions, and processed emotions without external guidance. This private dialogue supported emotional clarity and self-awareness. The physical environment supported these quiet intervals. Without constant mechanical noise or digital signals, the natural sounds of life became more noticeable. The ticking of a clock, the distant movement of air, the subtle sounds of activity elsewhere provided a gentle backdrop. These sounds did not demand attention. They simply accompanied it. Silence also shaped how people related to themselves. Without constant distraction, individuals became familiar with their own thoughts. This familiarity reduced fear of introspection. Being alone with one's mind did not automatically signal distress. It was a normal part of daily experience, offering insight and equilibrium. In social settings, silence served as a bridge rather than a barrier. It allowed transitions between topics, softened disagreements, and created space for empathy. When emotions ran high, silence often prevented escalation. It gave time for reactions to settle, allowing responses to emerge thoughtfully rather than impulsively. This comfort with silence influenced learning as well. Absorbing new information required moments of stillness. Understanding was allowed to mature rather than being forced immediately into expression. Teachers and learners alike respected the process of reflection, recognizing that comprehension unfolded over time. Silence also framed moments of transition. The beginning and end of the day were often marked by quiet rather than noise. These thresholds provided psychological closure and preparation. Moving from rest to activity and from activity back to rest felt less abrupt because silence softened the shift. In public life, this acceptance of quiet contributed to civility. Spaces were shared with consideration for others' presence. Loudness was not a default expression of importance. People adjusted their volume naturally, attuned to their surroundings. This restraint reduced friction and preserved a sense of collective ease. The absence of constant commentary allowed experiences to retain their depth. Events were not immediately analyzed or interpreted aloud. Meaning emerged gradually through reflection and conversation over time. This delayed processing preserved nuance, preventing quick conclusions from flattening complex experiences. Silence also protected memory. Without immediate narration or documentation, moments settled into recollection through feeling rather than explanation. Memories retained texture and ambiguity, allowing them to evolve as they were revisited. This fluidity enriched the relationship with the past, making remembrance an active, ongoing process. The pace of life supported this relationship with quiet. Without relentless acceleration, silence did not feel like lost time. It was understood as part of the rhythm, contributing to balance rather than detracting from productivity. Rest and reflection were not framed as opposites of action, but as its necessary companions. As years passed, this familiarity with silence fostered emotional resilience. People learned to sit with discomfort without immediate escape. Sadness, uncertainty, and fatigue could be experienced without being immediately alleviated or amplified. This tolerance allowed emotions to move through naturally, reducing their long-term impact. The social environment reinforced this capacity. Others did not rush to fill silence or fix feelings. Presence itself was often considered sufficient. This acceptance reduced pressure to perform emotionally, allowing authenticity to emerge without judgment. Reflecting now, it becomes clear that silence played a crucial role in sustaining the calm of that era. It created space for thought, for connection, and for recovery. It allowed time to feel spacious rather than compressed. Without silence, the rhythm of life would have lost its balance. This does not suggest that life was quiet in the sense of lacking activity or expression. Laughter, conversation, and sound were all present. What distinguished the era was the absence of constant noise. Sound appeared when it belonged, and silence returned naturally afterward. The memory of this balance remains instructive. It reminds us that silence does not diminish life, it enriches it. It offers a counterpoint to action, allowing meaning to resonate more fully. The calm we recall was sustained not only by what was done, but by what was left unsaid and unfilled. As we carry this understanding forward, it invites reconsideration of our relationship with quiet. It suggests that calm is supported by allowing space between moments, by resisting the urge to occupy every interval. The legacy of those years lives on in this insight, quietly affirming that silence, when welcomed, can be a source of steadiness and depth. In remembering how silence once felt natural and sufficient, we reconnect with a way of being that valued presence over expression. This remembrance does not demand a return to the past. It simply offers perspective, reminding us that calm can emerge when life is allowed to breathe, when silence is trusted as part of the human rhythm. As this long reflection approaches its later stages, attention turns gently to the way meaning was sustained across years without the need for constant affirmation. In that earlier time, many of us did not feel compelled to define our lives repeatedly or to explain our choices aloud. Meaning emerged through continuity, through staying with certain paths long enough for their value to become evident. Life did not need to be constantly interpreted in order to be understood. Purpose was often embedded in responsibility. People found direction not by searching endlessly for it, but by responding to what was placed before them. Obligations were accepted as part of belonging, and through fulfilling them, individuals discovered their own significance. This process was quiet and gradual. Purpose revealed itself over time, shaped by action rather than reflection alone. The absence of constant self-examination allowed people to remain outwardly oriented. Attention was directed toward tasks, relationships, and shared concerns rather than toward continual assessment of one's inner state. This outward focus reduced self-consciousness and allowed engagement to feel natural. People were present in their roles without needing to evaluate their performance constantly. This orientation influenced how satisfaction was experienced. Contentment arose not from achieving a final state, but from participating fully in ongoing life. There was pleasure in continuity, in knowing one's place within a larger pattern. Small accomplishments mattered because they contributed to something enduring rather than standing alone. The rhythm of contribution and reception sustained this sense of meaning. People gave their time and effort where it was needed, and in return, they received acknowledgement through trust and inclusion. Recognition was subtle, often implicit, yet deeply felt. Being relied upon carried its own affirmation. This dynamic shaped how individuals understood their worth. Self-esteem was grounded less in comparison and more in usefulness. Knowing that one's presence mattered, that one's actions made a difference within a familiar circle, provided stability. This grounding reduced anxiety about standing out or falling behind. The pace of life supported this integration of meaning. Without constant acceleration, there was time for purpose to mature. People could remain with their commitments long enough to see their impact unfold. This patience prevented discouragement when progress was slow. Meaning was not expected to appear quickly. It was allowed to grow. Relationships played a central role in this process. Shared experiences accumulated over years created depth and mutual understanding. Trust was reinforced through consistency rather than intensity. These relationships provided a context within which individual lives gained coherence. Being known over time mattered more than being noticed in the moment. Memory contributed to this coherence. Recollections were not isolated events, but parts of continuous story. Past efforts informed present choices, and present actions were understood as contributions to a future that would eventually become memory. This awareness connected different stages of life without urgency. The way people spoke about their lives reflected this integration. Narratives were simple, focused on events and actions rather than on abstract analysis. Life stories unfolded through description rather than interpretation. This simplicity preserved dignity, allowing experiences to speak for themselves. Work, family, and community roles all contributed to this sense of meaning. Even when tasks were demanding, they were understood within a broader context of contribution. Effort was justified by its place within a shared endeavor. This understanding sustained motivation without requiring constant reinforcement. Leisure also played its part. Rest and enjoyment were not escapes from purpose, but complements to it. They restored energy and perspective, allowing individuals to return to their responsibilities with renewed clarity. Balance was maintained not through deliberate optimization, but through intuitive adjustment. The acceptance of limits further supported this integration. People recognized that not everything could be achieved or resolved. Letting go of certain possibilities was part of maturity. This acceptance did not diminish life. It clarified it. By narrowing focus, individuals could invest more deeply in what remained. As time passed, this clarity often increased. Later stages of life were approached with a sense of continuity rather than rupture. Experience accumulated, offering perspective rather than regret. Reflection was informed by lived reality rather than speculation. This grounded reflection reinforced calm rather than disturbing it. Looking back now, it becomes clear that meaning was sustained not by constant pursuit, but by presence. Being where one was, doing what needed to be done, and remaining attentive to others created a life that felt whole. Purpose was not a distant goal. It was embedded in daily participation. This understanding offers insight into the calm we remember. Calm was not separate from meaning. It was a result of it. When life felt coherent, urgency diminished. When actions aligned with shared values, anxiety softened. Meaning provided orientation, allowing time to unfold without pressure. The memory of this coherence remains influential. Even as circumstances have changed, many of us still recognize its value. We sense when life becomes fragmented, when purpose feels scattered across competing demands. In those moments, we recall that another way once felt natural. This recollection does not impose judgment. It simply reminds us that meaning can emerge from continuity, from staying with what matters long enough for its value to become clear. The calm of that era was sustained by this patience, by the willingness to let life reveal itself gradually. As this reflection continues towards conclusion, the role of meaning appears not as a separate theme, but as a thread running through everything else. It connected routines, relationships, effort, and rest into a coherent whole. In remembering how meaning once unfolded quietly, we are reminded that calm and purpose often arise together, sustained by time, presence, and shared life. As this reflection reaches its natural conclusion, the calm of that earlier time reveals itself not as a single quality, but as a convergence of many small elements held together gently. Looking back, we see that nothing extraordinary was required to sustain it. The calm lived in the ordinary, in habits repeated without question, in relationships maintained without constant effort, and in time that was allowed to move forward without being pressed into service. Many of us now recognize that what gave those years their particular texture was a shared acceptance of life as something lived collectively rather than managed individually. There was a sense that one did not stand alone against time, responsibility, or uncertainty. Life was carried together through customs, expectations, and mutual adjustment. This collective orientation softened the weight of individual burden and allowed people to endure without feeling constantly tested. The passing of time itself felt less adversarial. Days were not experienced as units to be conquered or optimized. They were lived through, one after another, each carrying its own measure of effort and rest. When a day ended, it ended. There was closure rather than continuation into the night. Sleep marked a true pause, allowing renewal rather than merely interruption. This closure supported a sense of completeness. Even unfinished tasks were allowed to wait without generating persistent unease. There was trust that tomorrow would arrive with its own capacity to receive what remained undone. This trust reduced the need to rush, preserving energy for what truly required attention. Over years, this rhythm shaped character. Patience was learned not through instruction, but through experience. Waiting became familiar, and familiarity reduced frustration. Endurance developed quietly, strengthened by repetition rather than challenge alone. These qualities did not announce themselves, but they remained available when needed. The calm of that era was also sustained by modest expectations. Happiness was not defined as constant excitement or fulfillment. Contentment emerged through stability, through knowing what to expect and finding meaning within those expectations. Joy appeared in moments, not as a permanent state to be maintained. This realistic approach protected people from disappointment and allowed satisfaction to be felt without exaggeration. The relationship between people and time was marked by cooperation rather than conflict. Time was not perceived as something slipping away uncontrollably, but as something that accompanied life faithfully. Aging was understood as a natural progression rather than a problem to be solved. Each stage carried its own legitimacy, contributing to a broader sense of continuity. Memory played a quiet but essential role in sustaining this perspective. Looking back did not require deliberate nostalgia. The past was present in habits, language, and shared understanding. It informed the present without overshadowing it. Remembering did not mean longing. It meant recognizing continuity. As the world gradually changed, many of these patterns began to shift. Speed increased, demands multiplied, and attention became divided. Yet the earlier rhythm did not vanish entirely. It remained within those who had lived it, shaping expectations and responses. Even when life accelerated, there was an internal memory of steadiness, offering contrast and perspective. This internal memory often surfaced in moments of pause. When we slowed unexpectedly, when silence appeared, when routine returned briefly, we recognized something familiar. The calm did not need to be recreated fully to be felt. Its trace was enough to remind us that another way of living had once been ordinary. Importantly, this reflection does not suggest that the past was free of hardship or complexity. Difficulties existed, and not all experiences were gentle. What distinguished those years was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of structures that allowed struggle to be absorbed without overwhelming daily life. Calm coexisted with challenge because life was not constantly stretched beyond its capacity. The dignity of that era lay in its restraint. Emotions were felt deeply but expressed with care. Ambitions existed but were pursued patiently. Relationships mattered without needing constant reinforcement. Life felt anchored, supported by shared understanding rather than continuous negotiation. As we stand at a distance now, this restraint appears increasingly valuable. It suggests that calm is not achieved by eliminating effort or complexity, but by organizing life in a way that respects human limits. It reminds us that speed is not the only measure of progress, and that depth often requires time. The legacy of the 1960s, in this sense, is not a collection of images or events, but a way of inhabiting time. It is remembered through feeling rather than detail, through atmosphere rather than narrative. It lives on in the way many of us still value patience, continuity, and presence, even when circumstances make them hard to sustain. This legacy does not ask for restoration or imitation. It simply offers a reference point, a quiet example of how life once felt when hurry had not yet taken hold of everything. In remembering it, we gain perspective on our own pace, our own expectations, and our own relationship with time. The calm we recall was not dramatic or visible. It did not demand attention. It existed because life allowed it to exist. It emerged naturally from shared habits, mutual consideration, and acceptance of limits. It was sustained not by effort alone, but by collective agreement about what mattered. As this reflection closes, that calm remains present not as a loss, but as an inheritance. It continues to inform how many of us respond to the world, how we seek balance, and how we recognize the value of unhurried moments. It reminds us that time can be lived with dignity, that life can unfold without constant acceleration, and that meaning can grow quietly within continuity. In the end, the calm that existed before hurry took over everything was not a separate condition. It was simply the way life felt when allowed to proceed at a human pace. Remembering it now does not pull us backward. It steadies us, offering insight into what remains possible whenever we choose to slow, to attend, and to trust time once again.